right, hello. It's been a while since I've streamed because it's been a while since I've done research. I've been writing quite a bit, but this is a pretty new book, Marquis Black Trans Feminism, and it looks tremendously interesting, super duper interesting. So I can't wait to read it. I'm reading it right now. So here we go. I skipped the acknowledgements because they were kind of long. Abolition, Gender, Radicality, Introduction, Guide Quotes after Sylvia Wynter. While, as Fanon asserts, there's an imposition onto the figure of the black that would signify the confluence of racial identity and racial inferiority, there's also, in a way that's prior to the regulative force of that imposition and calls it into question, a resource working through the epidermalization of aphantasmic inferiority and the anti-epidermalization of the radical alternative, to which the peoples who are called black have a special kind of underprivileged relation in and as the very history of that imposition. One might speak then of the blackening of the common, which would imply neither that any and every person who is called black claims or defends the socio-poetic force of that fantasy, nor that persons who are not called black are disqualified from making such claims and enacting such defense. And I should add that I found this book from somebody on Twitter, a PhD student, was talking about it, and I've forgotten who the PhD student is, but I just followed them on Twitter, so you can just click my Twitter thing and find who I just most recently followed. And this is Fred Moten's The Universal Machine. If feminism is at its core about combating the dangerously unfair ways that power and oppression, recognition, and repudiation are distributed to individuals based on how their bodies are categorized, trans concerns lie at the heart of feminism. Laura Horek, Trans Studies, the black feminist position is trouble. It refuses to disappear into the general categories of otherness or objecthood, that is, blackness and womanhood, and refuses to comply with the formulation of racial and gender, sexual, emancipatory projects these categories guide. Denise Ferreira de Silva, Hacking Subject, Black Feminism, or Refusal Beyond the Limits of Critique. Feminism will be trans-feminist or not at all. The Horror Black Trans-Feminist Network, Manifesto for a Trans-Feminist Insurrection. The Futures of Blackness moves us to name the ways in which refusal to sequester and to quarantine black for black is inherent to blackness itself. Amy Victoria Atkins-Jones, Black Feminist Futures, reading Beauvoir, Black Skin, White Masks. But I need to make a distinction between black women. Black women is the subject of feminism, and black feminism is a critical disposition. I should like to think that black feminism is a repertoire of concepts, practices, and alignments, is progressive in outlook and dedicated to the view that sustainable life systems must be available to everyone. Hortense Spiller's Scholarly Journey of Hortense Spillers. From the Comey River Collective, a collection of black feminist meetings since 1974, and its critique of biological essentialism as a dangerous reactionary basis upon which to build a politic to transgenealogies of black feminism. Black feminism is always already trans. Shagasa Zizek's Transgender Trouble. Transgender is the gender trouble that feminism has been talking about all along. Jack Halberstam, Why We Need Trans Feminism. Black trans feminism, or black trans feminism, black trans feminism, and black trans feminism, where blackness is concerned. There's the refusal of sequestration, which is to say both a refusal to be set aside and isolated, as it is itself a sociality that demands relations of myriad natures, and to a refusal to limit this work to epidermalized demographics, dispersing its penchant for politicized subversions to all of those taking up the task. In mutinous relation to imposed ontology, blackness enables and conditions the inhabited spirit of subjective abolition. Transness, already shadowed by its echololic. Okay, I'm looking that up now. Echololic. The uncontrollable, no. Well, all the dictionaries are insisting it's not a word, but there is echolalia, the repetition of words or phrases spoken by others, often occurring in people with autism spectrum disorder or certain other mental disorders. Infants' repetition of sounds uttered by others. Okay, sorry. Transness already shadowed by its echololic blackness, as this book will demonstrate. Okay. Unfixes gender from essentialist moorings and posits itself precisely as that unfixation, as a departure from without the presumption of a stable destination, or indeed a departure that itself destabilizes destination desires. This transness is endemic to a genealogy that has its foundation the fundamental critique of the capaciousness of man, or man and woman, and as such the critique of the regulative regime of normative gender and categorization. Feminism, which is to say transfeminism, which is more to say black feminism, is an agential and intentional undoing of regular gender norms, and further, the creative deconstruction of ontological racial and gender assault, kind of gender deconstruction and unraveling down stitches, government means of subjectivation. Feminism is the reiterative, ungendered quotidian process of how not to be governed and given from without. Oh god, it's got endnotes. Okay, give me a moment. Any university press that forces or allows authors to use endnotes should be shut down. This is the introduction, right? Readers may note my separation of trans and feminism. Okay, yeah. Readers may note my separation of trans and feminism uncommon among most usages of the term, which often combined as trans feminism. My hope is that it does not strike the readers as uninformed or unethical, as I show you. It's not my intention to imply either of those about it. Either of these. Okay, I mean, I'll just keep reading. I'm following Julia Serrano's insistence on their separation. Serrano writing, many transfeminists prefer spelling transfeminism as separate words, where trans is an adjective that modifies feminism. The single word version of transfeminism looks somewhat alien, seems to suggest it's not actually a strain of feminism, but something else entirely. Just the single word trans women suggests that trans women are something other than women. Along similar lines, we don't describe people as Catholic women or lesbian women. Emphasis in original. Because I concur with Serrano's rationale that I replicate the practice of these pages. Additionally, I've noticed my pervasive use of trans rather than transgender. The prefix use of trans rather than the more specific transgender or transsexual is intentional since it allows for the open-endedness I seek. Following Bobby Noble and Sarah Lamble, and this thinking can be extended to blackness and transfeminism, rather than a mere umbrella term, I'm deploying transness as a political approach that questions, disrupts, and transforms dominant ideas about what's normal. Because the more explicit identity and transgender signify Because the more explicit identity that transgender signifies, and the pedantic distinctions between transgender, transsexual, etc. cannot hold, as Noble says, trans is my preferred term because it signifies subjectivities where bodies are at odds with gender presentation, regardless of whether that misalignment is self-evident in conventional ways or not. See Serrano and Martina Shade. Transforming feminisms. That is, feminism marks the division of imposed racial and gender ontologies that then demands an abolitionist modality of encountering the racialized gendered world. When you hold in your hands, what you hold in your hands is another treatise on how we might raciously rail against the harms done to an already known us. It's not a meditation on the violence done to black or trans or femme bodies, nor is it one concerned in the main with flipping the valuation of blind identities, e.g. the practice of lambasting white folks as the pinnacle of loving and doing black radical work, or the extent to which one points out the oversights of the white feminist cis woman as the extent to which, what was that for? Black feminist. I'm quite uninterested in talking solely about bodies and about what we already think we know. Indeed, our bodies cannot, must not be coveted in the final instance, for sure. It has come to be the site that suffers oppressive forces, because that is precisely how oppressive forces wish to constrict our subjectivities, to form them to understand ourselves, to form them and understand themselves as formed and toted by them. What we've come to name our bodies, though, is not the only way we can or should think ourselves possible in the world. Our subjectivity, my preferred, though still imperfect term, indexes the amalgam of the various ways that we engage sociality, and an engagement that's not determined wholly by or confined to the surface of corporeal reality, and if aspects of the body have come to be that which are formed by violent forces, it's necessary to find liberation in the aspects of subjectivity that exceed and ooze out of the body, and this uncaughtness is variously inflected and named, at least in part, by the black, the trans, the feminist. Additionally, this facilitates the dissolution of the things we may have come to regard as quite dear, namely our given and even reclaimed identities. It's come to a point, it seems to me, where many of us have crafted as virtuous the mere fact of holding steadfast the historically maligned identities we hold. Many of us have come to doubling down on racial identification or gender identification as expression on the grounds that such identities have historically and contemporarily been expunged from the province of positive valuation. There's little efficacy in clutching the purported fact, which is not a fact unmediated and transparent, that one is right or righteous or unceasingly wise because they don't hold in contempt their racialized blackness or their cis womanhood, for instance, categories that have been marginalized. That is not what this is all about. These identities are at base hegemonic bestowals, and will thus have diminished liberatory import in the final analysis. Indeed, we cannot get to the final analysis, which I offer as an abolitionist analysis, with these identities. If such an abolitionist terrain is given definition by the way in which by the way of the instantiation of the impossibility of violence in captivity. Black transfeminism cannot abide such classificatory violences, so it urges us to abolish the categories we now love, even if they have not always been received well. If the aim of the radical product of black transfeminism is abolition and gender radicality, which is a case I'll be making, it's imperative to grapple what that actually means. We cannot half-ass abolition, holding on to some of the things we would be called to task for giving up. If we want freedom, we need to free ourselves too of the things with which we capture ourselves. The project at hand is interested in a thoroughgoing conception of freeness, and it seems like black transfeminism, to call on Saidia Hartman, makes everyone freer than they actually want to be. That's a good quote. When the white woman or black trans person or the queer identified person comes to such a project with their indignation about me, us, black trans feminism, trying to take away the very things that they've worked so hard to achieve, we are surely to meet them with a certain level of kindness and ethical attentiveness to how such trauma has been felt and joys of mitigating in whatever way those traumas. But, and I mean this, we are not to capitulate to a sort of abolished world, because some people who may look like us are the people who have been forged in oppression are pleading to us. We still, even when grandma doesn't think she wants it, work to abolish the world. That is what black trans feminism wants, as an orientation toward radical freedom commits to. This is what black trans feminism as an orientation towards radical freedom commits to, and that will not be easy, nor will it feel good in the ways we expect. Like in the book so far. All this converges into what will concern this text, black trans feminism. Black trans feminism names this convergence and grapples with the tense and conflicting legacies that inhere in its nominative permutation of black trans, black feminism, and trans feminism. The aim then is to mine each of these for how they contribute to the culmination of black trans feminism as a modality of worldly inhabitation, an agential and performative posture in and after this world. In this way, black trans feminism theorizes power and, more importantly, the subversion of it in excess of wholesale notions of immediately discernible identities. Maintained then is how commitment to non-normativity, where normativity is understood necessarily as the terror of the normative, in which black trans feminism is disrupted and interrogative, is also concerned with an impossible desire for being held. Villarejo, tearing with the normative, Stelsa Brown, World on Fire. Villarejo clarifies further in its most benign form, normativity as appears. I don't understand why people use normativity like this. Appears as a bullying insistence towards obedience to social line hierarchy, and in this most lethal form carries it the punishment of death and resistance to them. In my view, queer theory brings immense resources to the analysis of an engagement with critique of normativity, resources precisely calibrated to the degree to which queer is deployed as a catachresis, as a metaphor without an adequate referent. Brown also brings in black feminism as integral, I don't know how to say that, to queerness, writing, radical black feminisms, my subject in this essay, are already queer as a critique normativity and normativizing processes. While captivity connotes violent grips, confining or flourishing, perhaps in thinking of a movement away from the captivity that is not toward but facilitated in its movement by an embrace, perhaps an impossible embrace without arms, an embrace without being bounded, a bear hug by arms that never close, we gain a different understanding of that toward which we aspire. The work of black trans feminism is always an aim for creative dimension of abolition and the worlds that arise because of the undermined hegemonic categories. Indeed, we are various shades of brokenness and lack, and I wish not to venerate this plight. We need to be healed and do not wish to remain writhing in our broken pieces. We need, in other words, to be held. But what I wish for, what black trans feminism might wish for, is a reconfiguring of how we hold each other without stopping, without withholding, all while we're on the run. I want to wager that this holding and being held without withholding is how one might be able to find footing on what is ultimately no ground. We cannot impart some of the violent things into the world. We are trying to create and cultivate the rebel of the old in the same form, for we would belie the world we are creating. I'll probably never cite this quote, but it's just a nice quote, so just in case. The urge to do that comes from wanting desperately to have a place. It comes from a desire promoted by a fear of loss, but as Claudia Tatus put it, while desire is constitutive of loss, desire also generates byproducts, even if it makes that deficiency conspicuous. It's just a citation, if only it could be parenthetical. Desire makes things that sometimes makes something else it invents. There is thus a different image of the world after the world I wish to posit, because I seriously. So abolition urges for the eradication of every and all violent holdovers. It is possible, though, that even on the groundlessness, even in a wholly other world, we can be held insofar as we are embraced by that which does not know us, and in this unknowing truly loves and caresses us. I don't know exactly what we're talking about here, but I think we might become anything at all, something wildly other than what we are. In order to give in to that, we need to be encountered by a world that really actually truly holds us and loves us by never ever presuming to know what shape we'll take and what we will want before we show up. Okay. We need to feel held, and we need to be held when we are not known from the start. The world we inhabit after and mid-abolition gender radicality doesn't know a damn thing about us, and it smiles on such a fact because when it finds out, it will know that we emerge from no coercion, no violence, no impositions. No one can begin another kind of living. I've highlighted more in just like 5 pages, the 6 pages that I usually highlight in most articles. This is good stuff. There is thus a fundamental commitment to life and livability and to modes of life that will not look like life, precisely because their dazzling abolitionist dwelling in the generative revel after the oft-mentioned end of the world. As such, black trans feminism is giving over. It's all so good. This is so good. As such, black trans feminism is given over as a loving but appositional shimmying away from the constantly repeated rhetorical move violence against women, especially trans women, violence against trans women, especially trans women of color, or especially black trans women. The move is understandable, and please keep making that gesture when it's appropriate as a way to highlight the populations onto which violation is disproportionately imposed, because we know black trans antagonism is very much about targeting poor black trans women of color. I proffer caution, though, in service of the attempted refutation of the assumption embedded in the italicized subclauses as an assumption that the subclause is black trans feminism, that once black trans feminism is encapsulated by pointing to the violated lives and deaths of black trans women. To me, troubling only allows black trans femme subjectivity to emerge through violence. Black trans feminism is articulated in this book as a love letter, a box of chocolates, a warm hug, a place to sleep after a hot meal. They got problems with you, you come get me, for those who live in excess of that purportedly unlivable nexus and those hailed by those analytic normatives, and further for those whose subjectivities are such that they cannot yet come. And black trans feminism's overall intent is to intervene in 2 primary discourses. First, a general identitarian discourse, which to be sure is not to be haphazardly denigrated as an unthinking mob mentality that considers blackness, transness, and feminism to be possessed identities from which politics emerge. I am black, I am trans, I am feminist. My aim then is to think about how we might rally around subversive politics, which then serve as one's identity as such, Catholic Cohen's political identities, or what Judith Butler calls thinking alliance. I wish to deem the corporeal surface as only one note of blackness, transness, and womanness, and the taking of such theorization seriously will necessitate radically undoing what we've come to hold dear. A subjectless critique, the broader argument that this book refuses to posit a or the subject of black trans feminism, rejecting a proper objective both study and knowledge production in service of eccentricity, to take language from Teresa de Loretti. I don't know. It's a black trans feminism that doesn't coincide with the amalgam of black and or trans and or women subjects, assuming that the being of these historicized demographics intends a certain relation to power and normativity and worldly inhabitation, but instead a black trans feminism that arises as a force of displacement, as a practice for the transformative of subjectivities, a methodology in conversational politicality with noun Chandler's desedimentary originary displacement and parentological Negro problematic that is also I would argue and have argued a gender problematic. Okay, so I don't know who Preciado is, but seems interesting. The second discourse in which I'm intervening is that which surrounds intersectional feminisms or social justice work done through an intersectionalist frame. Oftentimes these discourses take the identities that make up the various titular intersections to be givens, needing a critique or even more treacherously abandonment. While it's certainly a valiant or useful type of political work to reckon with how one's race and gender, for instance, bear on the situatedness in relation to institutions, history, and discourses, there's much to be wanted that black trans feminism seeks to examine. I maintain in alignedness with another loving critique of aspects of how intersections is deployed, that intersectional identities are the byproducts of attempts to still and quell the perpetual motion of assemblages, to capture and reduce them, to harness their threatening mobility, to which I wish to give primacy as the constituent force of black trans feminism. Quar. Don't know who that is either. Actually, this sounds familiar. There's also a way that intersectionality might, as Mark Rifkin explains in his meditation on black and indigenous irreducible differences, advance as if, say, one's race and gender have determinate boundaries, which can end up ratifying those boundaries in ways that not only rigidify them, but also naturalize them, as This, as noted, some models of intersectionality also naturalize politicized identities, constructing the boundaries between groups as pre-given and obscuring their genealogies, such as the shifting in nebulous ways the very meaning of black and women come to emerge. Sounds right. The second discourse in which I'm intervening is that which surrounds intersectionalist. Oh, sorry. In other words, what could be missing in intersectional feminisms is an attention to what is happening on the sidewalks around the road, the sewers underground, the skyscrapers up above, or what it sounds like out there. How does it sound? What snooze alarm and the person late for work needing to go 50 miles per hour with the speed limit. In the first place, black trans feminisms is our intention to those things as well, and ultimately the possibilities for reconfiguring what streets can look like, what kind of vehicles we can use, and how traffic patterns move in tandem with the pulse of the city. Inevitably, in all this, one wonders about the role and status of the body. While blackness, transness, and feminism are not entirely extricated from the body, it remains that the processes of materialization known as race and gender shape how we experience what we come to understand as our bodies. There isn't still an insistence here first on their fundamental distinction from being confined to corporeal reality. On this score, black trans feminism makes a twofold argument. First, that matter and materiality are not to be equated with mere being, a transparent and unmediated facticity of the body. I'm critical of the understanding of the material body as an unmitigated bearer and disseminator of truth, as if matter cannot be and has not been touched, as it were. The matter that makes of the black and transgender and women's subjectivities is in fact a regulatory ideal, has been made to congeal into a certain look, a look that inevitably excludes other looks for what might validly be considered black or transgender or women. This all seems so obviously right that it's, like, you know, I wish people would not think this is true. We come to know what a proper one of these subjects looks like by way unbeknownst or willfully ignored. When it gets down to it, too many highly regulated parameters that I'm in the business of deconstructing. It's precisely those regimes of regulation that, while they give us the shape and feel of marginalized identities, are the culprits of various normativities inherent to which a violent hegemony is correct. Regulatory norms create the obliviousness of this fact of such and such a body as black or transgender or women through forcible, which is to say coerced reiteration of tenets of which it is said to be possible for one to be, of what it is said to be possible for one to be. Because black trans feminism seeks to destroy such coercive violences, normativities, and hubristic assumptions, it's necessary to express a critical eye towards a simplistic formulation of materiality that fails to consider its highly regulated grounding. It's thus my contention that if such grounding were dutifully critiqued, it would yield the necessity for an abandonment of how matter and materiality are commonly understood in favor of a joyous disposition towards the tinkering and playing with how materialization has and can occur differently. Don't you have to write occurred here? There's an ongoing agency to materiality. There is an ongoing agency to materiality, thus processes of materialization, what we come to understand as matter. Thus processes of materialization, what we come to understand as matter, eclipsing the transness and transing of matter. Second component of this twofold argument is that race and gender are necessarily different from this book's constitutive terms, which cannot be located on or in, strictly speaking, the body. That is, the constituent terms of this book title, black trans feminism, cannot be said to be simply named to race and gender, or a disposition gotten to by a specific gender identification, e.g. women, nor can they be found on or in the body by some legible or transparent way. So while we indeed feel various oppressions in a visceral way, I want to make the claim that it's not because of our immediate access to the material body that is acted on by external forces, subsequently translating those feelings to a self which has perfect communication with the body. Body, too, or what we've come to understand as our body, is subject to epistemic scrutiny. It's not privy to unmediated knowledge in our unproblematic position. I mean, who thinks it is? Come on. But of course, many people do. We feel oppressions by virtue of those oppressions given to us in the subjective shape that houses the oppression is formed in the image of that oppression. The various ways we come to be confined and disciplined, which is to say the form and texture of our bodies, do not pre-exist ontologizing forces, whether benign or malevolent, but co-evolve with them. Is this, let me just, what is this, page 24? That's the only Heidegger in here. And there's no, there is some Merleau-Ponty. But that's the only Merleau-Ponty in here. So I don't do, like, phenomenology and stuff, and which means I don't read a ton of it, and I just like how much of this is like new? How much like is this not like surely there must have been thousands of words written about this, right? Like there can't be. I don't know. In short, the construction of that is the body, which is never as simple as the definite article implies, since other identificatory vectors always complicate its definitiveness, becomes largely through hegemonic structures that track along axes of epistemology, ontology, ocular centrism, and neuronormativity, all of which is shorthand to what we might recognize as the project of Western civilization. These are territorializing projects, colonialist and imperial project, if you will, that must be subverted even if they are the visceral basis of our comfort. Indeed, black women and femmes alone. Whoops, what did I just do? Indeed, black women and femmes along the jagged orbit that meanders around cis and trans have long taken their imposed corporealized ontologies as indicative of a system with instabilities and fractures that they were made to bear the weight of, and thus are poised to deploy those fracturative forces against the system itself. See, for example, TLSM flex conjure crack. I want to commit to the argument that neither blackness nor transness nor the implicit woman as the subject of feminism is tied to a specific kind of body or identity. They are to me inflections of mutinous subjectivities that have been captured and consolidated into bodily legibilities. With this, however, it is ethically necessary for me to say something about the lives of those who live as black and or trans and or women, and to dwell on something perhaps idiosyncratic about these identities as identities, ethically necessary because of my own identificatory positionality, which reads a certain way, but is, I wholeheartedly submit, inaccurate. Curious minds will want to read this endnote. Well, any minds will want to read every endnote because that's the only way to read a book. Sorry, I look over here as if to talk to you, but you are here. Over here is where I have my streaming stuff. Over here is my webcam. Everybody should read endnotes. Come on. What's this endnote? This is a bit of a vexed subject, one I've long avoided. It used to be in somewhat still as a common practice, especially back in the 90s or the early 2000s for those in critical race theory and or for those in critical race theory or feminist gender studies that they were not of color and or women, to make clear they were not of color and or women and could never know those realities. That is, white people studying race and cis men studying gender or feminism would often make clear it is sometimes spectacularly and yawn-worthy effect the limits of their epistemological reach to their identity. There's a monstrously large archive of text after text noting how one's whiteness disallows them from really knowing what the life of blackness is like, or how one's biological aside maleness disallows them from knowing the depths of women's lives. All of this is fine, I suppose. It is, however, something I have not really done. And why is this? On the one hand, the aforementioned rhetorical moves often strike me as disingenuous at worst and nowhere going at best. The same song and dance, I'm white so I can't know black stuff, or I'm a dude so I can't know women stuff, and later in the game I'm cis and I can't know trans stuff, got old very quickly and seeming perfunctory and cordoned off from the theorizing or intellectual work that followed, which I must admit was much more interesting to me. And now I'm putting on my own song and dance, as non-singing, non-dancey as I might think it is. This is very singing and dancing, my friend. Into my own text, albeit an endnote. What do you mean albeit an endnote? You must always read the endnotes. Which I hope you know the reader is intentional. Let me not make another spectacle like the ones I feel so iffy about. This is already a spectacle. This has been 2 paragraphs so far. On the other hand, I'm still unsure where my identity lies as to what I may like claim. For instance, I'm black. Those bring questions as I'm identified as black all the time. After all, if things get trickier, maybe because of this they do. After this things get trickier, maybe because of this they do. I would not be as unwavering in saying that I'm straight. Though gay doesn't actually capture me, it doesn't accurately capture me in any substantive way, nor is bisexual or pansexual. I've come to find a comfortable home and queer. Many would say that my sexual history, which is not to say, at least for me, that queerness is only conservative sexuality, doesn't qualify me for queerness. My queerness comes from a commitment to gender self-determination and the axiom that gender cannot be determined simply by looking at the body. To say that I understand myself through queerness is to say that I may be and have been attracted to non-op trans men or trans women or a trans woman who passes as cis but is adamant about holding on to the transness of her womanness, or non-binary person, all of which do not map onto straightness, if you insist. It would be at the very least simply off to say that I'm straight when, say, expressing attraction for a trans woman, as it would possibly in a sense disqualify transness for being constitutive of the body and identity to which I am attracted. Okay. I do not intend to do that thing, where ostensibly straight people perform the lament of their straightness. You're doing it. Oh god, straight people are so problematic, so basic, and I hate that I'm one of them. I wish you could just, not be. I kind of get it. I do. At times it seems politically necessary to distance oneself from heterosexuality and its accompanying cis-normativity in order to be sufficiently radical and given to liberatory politics. I don't want to knock you all for that desire. Tell me you don't share that desire, dude. But this skews too close to me to biological determinism and retroactive naturalization of the purported inherency of the sexuality that is in fact historicized. That is in fact a historicized construction. Sexuality is not some innate thing with its parameters all in place beforehand. This is not to say one can choose to be gay or straight or bi or pan. Rather, it's to say that straightness and gayness and biness are predicated on historically and culturally delimited understandings and requisites for which one locates both one's sexuality as well as where one locates the operative erogenous hotspots on one's desired object. For the first part, I wish to quote H. Sedgwick. It's a rather amazing fact that of the very many dimensions along which the general activity of one person can be differentiated from that of another, dimensions that include preferences for certain acts, certain senses or sensations, certain physical types, certain frequencies, certain symbolic investments, certain relations of age or power, certain species, a certain number of participants, and so on. Precisely one, the gender of the object of choice emerged from the turn of the century and has remained as the dimension denoted by the now ubiquitous category of sexual orientation. Sexual orientation or sexuality is the product of the a priori delimitation and foreclosure of other weighted criteria that might have come to take the lead in determining it. See Sedgwick, epistemology of the closet, emphasis in the original, not to mention too that my sexual desire and the desire of those given to sexual and gender radicality is one very much concerned with creating the script of one's ostensible sexual identity according to the given definition of proper use of sex organs, proper identification of sex organs, proper alignment of sex organs between partners, and proper connotations, the implications resulting in proper usage. Identification and alignment, that would be what Paul Preciado calls realist generalist and the straight homosexual naturalist. By contrast, I and the other sexual and gender radicalists approach sexuality, if it can be called such, on the untender and unfixed grounds, being and becoming those for whom the organ, biological or synthetic, alive or techno-semiotically incorporated is merely the interface by which they can access certain forms of pleasure or effect that can't be represented by sexual difference, gender, or sexual identity. These are Preciado's lexicon countersexualist. Abolition gender radicality asserts a countersexual relation to imposed ontological sexual identities. To the second point, that of where one locates erogenous hotspots on desired objects, that we can say one's gender doesn't reside in perinatal gender assignment, not the least of which is to say that genitals perhaps not readily given transparent meanings as penises or vaginas, perhaps that or should be in scare quotes, should also be in scare quotes, are largely hidden from view when one even determines their sexual attraction to one person or thing. Means that how we know the gender of our desired object is mired in some things that have, as it were, been prechewed. In short, to be a man attracted to other men bypasses that where one locates, reads, sees, knows another manness is tainted from the start, which is to say our sexualities, though feeling so deeply rooted, are damn dirty liars. Take gender butler on this front. Anatomy is a condition of sexual fantasy, but also gets radically transfigured, an apt phrase considering chapter 3 of this book, by sexual fantasy, so I think we should be making, what's chapter 3? Transfigurative blackness. So I think we've been making a big mistake if we thought that sex between Barry and Winchell, proclaimed straight man and his lover, drag performer was straight or gay. But Lawyer continues, I'm not sure we can say. I'm not sure we should say it. Maybe it will be that it's romantically and even sexually very straight for both of them, extremely straight, even though there are two penises in play. It just means that the meaning of the penis is going to be transfigured within the sexual scene, or that the penis may well be put out of play. We don't know what kind of play it was, but if it's put into play, the question is, in the service of what sexual fantasies are put into play. For example, think about Boys Don't Cry. We're going to say that Brandon Tina was having straight sex with a girlfriend, his girlfriend, or is it lesbian sex? My sense is that their sex puts the distinction into crisis, and that's probably all the more interesting and exciting by virtue of the fact that it eludes the categories that are available to it. Where is anatomy in that? In fact, the meaning of genitals is radically displaced when we interrogate their role, they affix subjects and their function, which dissolves the question of sexuality indeed into a question itself. One cannot maintain the discrete categories of homosexual or heterosexual, for instance, unless cis-normativity is maintained. A cis-normativity that necessarily violates aberrant subjectivities and identifications. Thus, with my own nebulous and timid non-binariness, whom I they them pronouns see below, and with the nebulousness of others' identifications and somatic meaning, sexuality cannot be so vociferously clutched as if innocent. In part, what I'm arguing is that to presume the innocence of sexuality is to overlook its violation of otherwise identification that not been sanctioned by what Butler would call the heterosexual matrix, or put differently, cis-heteronormativity. Neither am I so sure I would identify as cisgender or cis, though most would say I surely do not qualify for transgender or transness. Sure, there have been a decent number of occasions where someone assumed that I was transgender because the work I do 14 times that I've been counting, and sure people count these things. And sure, I use and am hailed sometimes by they them pronouns and think my subjectivity through non-binary is but does that mean I have access to saying that I am trans before answering so quickly? Two things must be noted. First, it's well known, at least in trans studies, that transness is not simply or even primarily about being a certain kind of gendered body. Transness lies elsewhere. In short, can one access transness and be validly woven through the subjectivity of transness via other realms that both lie outside the body and that assert the meaning of body in a radically different way? Can bodiness itself be trans through the gendering of sociality and interpersonal semiotic meaning making in ways not beholden to the normativities of this world? Whatever. Second, because of my blackness and the fact that blackness makes for gender trouble, that blackness, somatic endowmentness, and original desedimentary problematizing of ontological mandates are not given over readily and perhaps at all in the gender binary and cisness, Perhitens, Spillers, and Chagall and Kayam Green, or C. Riley Snorton, and Diane DeTournay, and Harry Zayed, and am I automatically unable to claim cisgender status even if I wanted, which to be sure I vehemently do not, though someone like Spanish would say that's not a matter of jamming black people into category of cisgender, which black people and blackness do not fit within, but rather one of recognizing that we are non-trans, which acknowledges the cisness disallowed black people and blackness, but doesn't relegate those who might otherwise be called cis to the status of trans, and relinquishing them unjustifiably for what could be called cisgender privilege. Though I'm not simply talking about privileges and double standards, it is and must be about different and differing modes of subjectivity. So where I'm at right now is understanding myself in the following way. I'm black, or more accurately, I do blackness, kind of categorical irreverence, unwilling to abide normative impositions. I'm not straight, though neither am I bi or queer pan, but perhaps I do queerness, which is to say I have queer relationship sexuality. I'm not trans per se, but enact subjectivity in ways that seek a trans and gendering of sociality or interpersonality, which is to say I have a trans relationship to gender. Fine. That's all fine. Thus I choose not to recapitulate the war and discourse of lived experience that I speak to a bit more in chapter 2, but to advance a much more complex and rich notion of opacity. Give its most fleshed out articulation by a word. Consent. Opacity denotes a departure from the Western imperative of transparency, inherent to which is a reduction. In other words, to be transparent and thus legible to a predominating scheme of intelligibility, one must always have the breadth and subjectivity reduced, distilled. One's differences that may fall outside the scripts of possibility, for example, gender non-binariness, must be captured by the norm, linked to it in some way, which deprives the difference of something essential to it. Offers opacity to combat this enclosure with an impenetrable autarky. Just a citation. Opacity refuses reduction and perfunctory transparency and preserves the singularity of those who are so often coerced into making themselves digestible. Opacity also allows for a kind of quiet or loud claim to something unable and unwilling to be given to others. Such privacy is ethically important because of its potential for something like solace amid regimes of violence. I'm conceding the fact of opacity for those who live through the identificatory markers of blackness, transness, and womanness because it may very well be one of the few things keeping them alive, and I'm committed to nothing if I'm not committed to life. But there's more to be said of opacity as it relates to my concerns. Opacity is more robustly a tactical evasion that eludes the medicalized biometric and regulatory framework of knowing a subject. Marginalized and oppressive subjects, like those indexed by the titular terms of this book, can retain the specificities of their position as differently subject to the aforementioned regulatory regimes, and that's what I must hold on to, though the fixation I delineate in later sections of this introduction must still be foregrounded. I guess I have to read the later section of the introduction to know what the heck that is. To do this, I urge readers to understand opacity as a vehicle precisely for the eradication of those differentiations that are base violence and destruction created by forces of hegemony. Maybe. To be understood as categorically black or trans or woman is fundamentally an imposed identity, a given ontology that ultimately in the world after the end of the world must be discarded because of its link to being forged in the cauldron of originary violence. To take this phrase from Fred Moten's Case of Blackness, Moten writes, somewhat famously, what is inadequate to blackness is already given ontologies. The lived experience of blackness is, among other things, a constant demand for an ontology of disorder, ontology of dehiscence. I don't know, I can kind of tell what this means, but I gotta look it up. Partial or total separation of previously approximated wound edges due to a failure of proper wound healing. A para-ontology whose comportment will bend toward the ontic or existential field of things and events. Opacity in its usage, in my usage, argues that one situatedness is important and that it provides access to mechanisms of power that have created the conditions for ontologized accidents. I've for example, epidermal blackness and normative gendered physicality, to be denigrated and expunged from the province of social validity. It's accidents here. Whatever. There's a way that being forced to hold this denigration on what gets consolidated as a kind of body that approximates but doesn't measure up to the human ideal in some ways crucial to note, as burying the viscera is a different kind of knowledge that some do not have access to. But opacity does not end here, and certainly not in the way that proponents of an unceasing and uncritical valorization of lived experience is the pinnacle of the epistemic argumentation put forward. Opacity concedes this experiential specificity is radically inclusive. Well, I guess he's about to explain this, or they're about to explain this. Sorry, I don't know. This endnote really fucked me up. I guess this person is they, not he. I guess which they're about to explain. Opacity concedes the experiential specificity is radically inclusive, which is to say that it's specific to certain kinds of bodies, but it provides knowledge and world making onto epistemic forces that can be mobilized by any and every body and non-body. Good, yeah, fine, okay. I think it's a little far to call that radically inclusive, but it's inclusive. Immediately following Glossan's mention of the impediment for all autarky, it goes on to say that opacities can coexist and converge, weaving fabrics. That is to say, one's experiential blackness or transgender identity is and can be opaque to non-black and non-trans people. Indeed, it's simultaneously, however, that the knowledge and itch for otherwise ways of living glean from being positioned as such as not parochial, in fact, weavable, convergent, coexistent with everyone else. Furthermore, this is to say that opacity is not static. One is not simply to be black or trans or women, being opaque to those who are not black, trans, women, which is then the end of the story. Opacities shift and move depending on how various identities get positioned in a given context, and also, perhaps more importantly, how identities get deployed in order to create opaque pockets that become impenetrable to power, or if penetrated, how that probe may enter but not come out to creatively remix or enhance her scheme. I draw here from Hurston's Mules and Men, in which he writes the Negro offers a feather bed resistance, that is, we let the probe enter but it never comes out. Gets smothered under a lot of laughter, pleasantries. It's going to be until 25. There's a substantive endnote. We come to understand the opacities are created, not simply given or possessed ontologically, so the shifting opacity is predicated ultimately on how we create zones of opacities, and that's what I mean by political identities. On fixation, I maintain it as axiomatic, that is now as clearly argued, radical feminism must center the needs, experiences, and material concerns as black of trans women, trans femmes, and non-binary femmes. Any black trans feminist worldview is undeserving of the name if it's not grounded by the various epistemic forms proffered by the aforementioned demographics. Two, though, I want to maintain this while simultaneously maintaining the unfixation of transness and blackness of feminism and the factorial proliferations from the terrain of and ownership, and thus burden of responsibility for liberation of those who are said and or say themselves, of those who are said to and or say themselves embody the numerous imbrications of these identities. The black trans feminism I want to begin to theorize, not exactly so, is one that, again, as Rouse says, is not simply about the inclusion of trans bodies or trans feminine people into feminism, but also one that's not simply about assuming that one's embodied marginalized identity is sufficient to preferring radical politics. I am so hot. It is like 1,000,000 degrees and my AC is not doing the job. To do black or trans feminist work is not done. To do black and or trans and or feminist work is not done solely or monolithically by those whom historical sociology has deemed black, trans, or women, or all three. I don't understand the grammar there, but I get the picture. Indeed, if the project of radical transfeminism, most certainly black radicalism, is characterized as a heterogeneous, decolonizing, anti-capitalist feminist project, then black transfeminism here wishes to think itself and its adherents as those who commit to engendering themselves through these performative enactments. I think this is the same set of yaps. To inhabit a world as unfixed requires one to let go profoundly, but this profound letting go with respect to profound gaining of profound gaining of something else that might allow us to do things differently. The present conditions must undergo an immense detachment. We must detach unfixed from such conditions if we are to engender something other than this. It's untenable to stick with what we have now, what exists now, if we heed that a radical end of the world requires the radical end of this world, and its signatories. This other world that is here and now, another world that harbors otherwise states of becoming, and a you beyond you, to borrow from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, whose work will be discussed in Chapter 4, necessitates the serious rethinking of who we are and what we know. It's a fundamentally radical onto-epistemic mediation in service of finding another way to live with one another. Black transfeminism is nothing other than radicalism is nothing other than radicalism, and is a departure from these typical definitions of radical. From typical definitions of radical, the etymological, going back to the roots towards, well, a more radical definition. Radical is imaginative will to engage life unbounded. The radicality discussed in these pages is an adjectival mobilization towards what has not yet been realized or reconceptualized, or conceptualized, an imaginative speculation about how we might be, where we might end up, what might exist, and what might be possible. I don't know the difference between adjectival mobilization, realization, or conceptualization and adjectival mobilization. Or conceptualization and imaginative speculation, especially. But I don't know. That's whatever. Radical and radicality denote a way of being unbeholden to normative constraints for legibility, politics, subjectivity, knowledge, and relationality. And blackness is radicality functions in a transitive manner because it's inflected with respect to but not confined by sedimented notions of racial quantum. It staves off uncertainty, invites trouble. It staves off certainty. That makes more sense. Invites troubled orientations, ill abides taxonomy, keeps at a distance existence ahead of itself. It's an unfolding of the fold that demands a different subjectivity. Transmisses radicality functions differently than, but not to the exclusion of, transgender. Specifically, it functions as a way to think about how things come together and how they work with, on, and in one another. About movement and change, transness asks us to meditate on the manifold ways a thing can present itself differently as as Chaim Green states allows us to let go of stability. Black feminism's radicality, that perpetual refusal of institutionalization, manifests in attunement to the regimes of ontological genders and works those regulative traps by unsuturing them and fracturing genders and positions. Black feminism and its underpinning transfeminism mutates the state's attempt and function to render things immobile, a function Michel Foucault has noted, and names that which cannot be kept in place or moored to the normative ledgers of history. Taken together, these understandings of blackness, transfeminism undergird the start of the hieroglyphic theorization that would come to be understood as black transfeminism and abolitionist gender radicality. And ontological blackness and ontological gender are anathema to those abetting the proliferation of black transfeminism, as these ontologies tend toward a reification by which race and gender in particular become treated as if they exist objectively and independent of historical contingency or subjective intentions. That, I think, is actually very unfair, but whatever. Resultant is a categorically essential racial and gender consciousness, unable to hold difference and hostile when met with critique, leading to a nebulously and inconsistently exhaustive principle of racial and gender identity, their thoroughgoing index and trapping more than liberating. Indeed, the terms homosexual, heterosexual, and transsexual, as well as other markers like man, women, masculine, feminine, whiteness, blackness, brownness, dark habits, and rights are all historically variable terms, untethered in fixed or, for that matter, natural and inevitable ways to bodies and populations. Yeah, but this doesn't support this, surely. The contingency, though merely a speculation of what might have been, is precisely the space in which I dwell here, as what might have been is what we are after, since it is in contradistinction to violence of what has been and is, rather than seeing contingency as bygone thought. It here reads as it is read here as the seeds of possible ways we might have fixed ourselves from violence of what had been and is. If what might have been the historical contingency is fundamentally not what has been and is, which is the battleground on which we do all the radical work, then it serves as a potent and rich dossier of rethinking ourselves differently, of unfixing ourselves, and unfixation is an explicative, transitive relation to powers. What do you mean transitive? What does that mean? Is that supposed to be a pun or something? Relation to powers, grasp its ability to coerce meaning onto us. What might have been can be what will soon be. Readers, I guess maybe it's not a pun. Maybe I see what's... No, I still don't understand. Readers may have begun to notice something that could be seen as troubling, namely the seeming overlooking of structural barriers. What? You know, we're 14 pages in. Who could be angry about this yet? A structural and terrestrially sociostructurally ontological anti-blackness, sexism, and trans-antagonism is an onus not elided in the anti-categorical you get what I mean. Anti-categorical blackness, transness, feminism. No, do not mistake me. What I offer is a celebratory and radically liberatory analysis of these modalities instead of a rehashing type account of how their identificatory corporeal signifiers are hemmed and maligned by hegemonic forces. And this, I assure you, is in service of the absolute eradication of the forces compelling the hegemon. Anti-blackness, trans-antagonism, sexism, and the hierarchized gender binary are all structures that disallow such freedom of choice and movement that I've implied thus far, one might think. Sure. And to be sure, one thinks this on justifiable grounds, as one cannot merely opt out of the plight of anti-blackness, say by willing oneself in excess of those structural fetters. But the radicality of self-determination, for example, declaring fashion one's own subjectivity in the objective face of historical material and social structures, is a bedrock of any subversion of the very ills that foundation oppressive structures. This is a verb, I guess. I do not approve. And I don't think I buy this. I mean, I should be more, I don't buy it, but I guess I don't care if I buy it. I'm fine if I have to buy it. Well, let's keep reading. And outside of the structures must be imagined if there is any chance of getting their sovereignty. Their utter undermining in the form of gender self-determination might be one of those outsides. Oh, that's a nice quote. And there are others in as much as perinatally designated. In fact, no, I'll go back and there are so many quotes here that are useful. I'm going to go back to this and copy and paste later. And there are others in as much as perinatally designated sex and gender, white supremacist epigeneralization of values, or cis male supremacist subordination and validation of those who are not cis men or structural regimes. Their cessation requires an irreverence towards their organizing logics and all their claims about the world. I wonder if that's true. I think it's better for me if it's true, so let's just say it's true. Let's keep reading. The politicality of blackness, transness, and feminism allows this to occur, as they're not tied to the structures that attempt to know subjects and grounds that precede them. Blackness thus will outlast race, transness will outlast gender, feminism will outlast women. They outlast the identities often suited to them because it's engendering fugitive forces. They precede and exceed their capture in these identities, and further they referentially index one another as different lateral and proverbial hues of another. Blackness, transness, feminism are radical and fugitive rhymes for one another. Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Fugitive black trans feminism. Or fugitive black trans black fugitive. The moment anti-woman had to be addressed by Sojourner Truth, the moment she had to bear a breast to prove that she was a woman was already a queer trans moment. So that rather than seeing ourselves as outside blackness, as outside dialogue of queerness and trans, I think we need to place ourselves as black females at the core of the dialogue. Bell hooks. The black trans feminism index is a thing that's been simmering for a while now, bubbling up in the most and least incendiary of places. It's instructive to excavate the historical archive of the way in which it's tried to manifest blackness through a vector of fugitivity, though imperfectly, as all manifestations of fugitivity are happy to be. And it's fugitivity that I want to use here for now is the indexation of the paralogical distinction between blackness and people deemed black, which will then open up transness and black feminism to similar distinctions. So, into the archive. Approved and signed into law by George Washington on February 12, 1793, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 articulates preoccupation with statelessness and territory, and the burgeoning formation of a nation boundedness in more ways than one. National, corporeal, and intellectual became prioritized. Fugitive slaves were broadly conceived as those who transgressed imposed boundaries, breached the geographic confines. This is not Marquis stuff, but it's getting highlighted. were broadly conceived of those whose transgress the imposed boundaries, breached the geographic confines of the plantations that they could not call home, undermined the perceptual boundaries of the limits of slave or negro capacity, escaped the grasp of wisp, horses' laws, dogs' laws, and desires demanding their confinement, and demonstrated the capacity to autonomously steal that which was deemed property themselves. Fleeing the state or territory was effectively an escape to life and freedom as the fugitive status as slave, being bounded by the state or specific location for which they fled, dissolved on their own. Of note, two in Section 6 of the Amended Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is that no trial or hearing under this act shall be the testimony of such alleged. In no trial or hearing under this act shall the testimony of such alleged fugitive be admitted into evidence. An extension of the imposed incapacity onto the bare ontology of the slave. In this era, and arguably in the contemporary moment, synonymous with blackness. But in all of this law cannot hold. The two laws were inadequate, as they could not ensure the fugitive's capture. On some accounts, in fact, it became even more difficult to recapture fugitives as they became more adept at eluding power's grasp. Mr. Mason of Virginia, who introduced the 1850 law because the previous one lacked sufficient severity, tellingly notes that under the 1793 fugitive slave law, you may as well go down into the sea and never become from his native element a fish which has escaped from you, as expect to recover such a fugitive. Good. They run away, the subject engendering another iteration of themselves, transcend themselves, quintessentializes the tenor of fugitivity, a perpetual fishy, escapeful smotheriness that power's hands cannot contain. The law attempts to enact sovereignty as an insovereign nonentity. Too cute. In both laws, fugitivity extends to those who do the work of aiding and abetting a fugitive, and more notably impeding the capture of fugitives. Fugitive slave law claimed everyone to make a dire choice. Choose the proliferation of captivity or the proliferation of escape. With the historical mobilization, I think animal laws might do that too. With the historical mobilization of fugitivity through blackness, I want to gesture, in fact, let's highlight. Oops. With the historical mobilization of fugitivity through blackness, I want to gesture toward their interrelatedness. I want to gesture toward because this historical proximity, blackness being given the capacity I intend for it through fugitive slave laws. The 1793 law states in the second section, if any person or person shall by force set at liberty rescue the fugitive from the subject agent while transporting the person or person so offending shall on conviction be fined and imprisoned. And as the 1850 law says in 7th section, then the assistant runaways after notice or knowledge of the fact that such persons was a fugitive from service or labor before said shall for other such offences be subject to a fine and imprisonment. I'm thoroughly aware that, say, white abolitionists helping usher fugitive slaves to the North do not occupy the same historical and ontologically objective positions as the runaways themselves, and don't wish to complain. The two, my assertion in part is that these white abolitionists engendered themselves in their world through an in proximity to a pure ontological blackness. They, as I expound upon later in this book in a slightly different context, became black and subjectivated themselves politically via deployment of fugitive blackness. I mean, this is... Alright, fine, I'll read the book. Blackness became non-proprietary and radical and serious, and seriously radical stands on this front. There is this to say the parentological movement refuses to give definition or essence to purportedly extant historical figures precisely because via the desedimentary deconstructive differential work of these subjects, there is to be found no definition or last essential analysis. The deconstructive work of desedimentation of parentological sinews and ligaments is, if you allow me this neologism, non-definissential. Because of this, we can never distinguish between who or what is within or without the ostensible boundaries of the very thing we mark as possessing a transparent definition or essence. Hence, the criteria for inclusion and exclusion dissolve into nothingness, thus making the world of parentology the recognition of this dissolution, and from there, joyfully conceding that there are no criteria for subjective verification, no ontological grounds on which to stand in order to be viable, indeed no groundedness that invites subjects into his place to stand para and non and ontologically. Very Nagarjuna. Blackness in its parentology and the taking seriously of the parent, whatever. Yes, in its parentology, taken seriously, the parentology can and must be mobilized by any and all who commit to radicality and ontological desedimentation, named that insurrectionary radicality. Oh, they're quoting themselves. Cool. My assertion, did they say they're quoting themselves? No, just say you're quoting yourself. Don't leave me in suspense. My assertion in this additional part is also, that neither do two different fugitive slaves occupy the same position, that positions are ever shifting and dependent on myriad victors of subjectivity. So the matter of deeming only those who have and are subjected due to what was called then Negroid phenotype is moot. One is indeed placed, as it were, in a box by virtue of radicalized blackness. That box, however, doesn't imply a closed and put out loop, allowing us to predict the outcome every time. Or what I might say is a gesture towards radical transfiguration at any time. I don't understand that. Being put in a box says a little about how one occupies that box and how others relate to that box. A slave in this era may, if you will, be sitting in the bottom right corner of the box, and another might be standing in the center of the box, one more might have tunneled out of the bottom unbeknownst to anyone else, and still another might be running around the box without clothes, taunting the box's edges, finding seams in its walls to stick a toe into or peer out of. All these textured ways of inhabiting the box matter more than given credit. It's too metaphorical. And it's this way we move or lie or not in the box, and what others understand about the box. Do they call the box arcade or square? Do they boxes or not? Do they know how the boxes are made? Do they plan to do something about the presence, shape, or material temperature of the box? Do they tell us about those certain kinds of boxes? Do they do things to eradicate boxes and exploit the seams in those boxes to create more airflow? That matters quite substantively. It is not sufficient to say, as I know some of y'all are thinking, that they're still in the box. I wasn't thinking that, for what it's worth. Precisely because one is not known and one does not live only via the vector of imposition. We are not in our entirety box people, because we too interact with the box, foregoing who we are in that relation. So much so, perhaps, that box says less and less about our circumstances, modes of inhabitation than others as important stitches of how we show up in this and other worlds. Maybe. My interest lies in a thing or non-thing that is being punished, fugitivity as the site of proximity to blackness, which then serves as blackness as such, as blackness, that is, the criminality that brings the law online, a lawless force that though named blackness, I don't think so, but, a lawless force that, though named blackness, must be understood in its ontological difference are black people important too, as Fred Moten's Stefano Harney's claim that while this anoriginary drive they deem blackness, an anorigin that is the surplus of an always unlocatable origin, a displacement of origins, a desire for origins, is distant from people called black, is distinct from people called black. Those deemed black are nevertheless underprivileged insofar as they are given to an understanding of it. The opaque beings that index and allude to the open. The opaque beings that index and allude to the open onto-epistemic trove. My brain is short-circuiting when I hit interesting grammar. The trove is the understanding to which the underprivileged are given, but the understanding is open to being understood by any and everyone, and non-one. But in the spirit of this introduction, indeed this entire book, there is the immense need to examine the gendered components of this fugitivity. What if to argue for blackness is fugitivity, and fugitivity's blackness is already to argue in and through the volatility of gender, gendering, and ungendering. To illustrate this in a historical sense, we can fruitfully turn to the variety of laws and social decrees that derogated gender expression not befitting one's true gender, setting a biblical precedence is Deuteronomy, 2nd law 22. What is this doing here? Tell me, please. 22:5, which notates that a man's item shall not be beyond a woman, and a man shall not wear a woman's garment, whoever does such a thing is an abhorrence unto Adonai, or Jehovah, or God. Please, where is this coming from? To don dress, which is potent with an implicit or unexpected revelation of gendered veracity, doesn't align with one's gendered assignation as a divine aberrance. To trans one's gender through the sartorial in this case is a transgression of the sovereign force of God, biblically speaking. Briefly then, we see how transness and blackness converge, where trans expression is a rebuking of a purported divine sovereign decree, and blackness as radicalism is found in the critique of political theology and thus of God as a governor or world manager. Blackness as indexical, according to J. Cameron Carter, is sacrality without property and without sovereignty. If we can conclude preliminarily that laws, I don't understand how blackness came in, sorry. Yeah, I reread it and I still don't. If we can conclude preliminarily that laws and customs prohibiting certain modes of dress serve to curtail certain people from inhabiting social spaces in ways not part of the legibility of sociology as dictated by the discursive and socio-historical power, there's a crucial connection to be made. Maybe now they're explaining this. Is actually where it's going to happen. Even before explicit laws prohibiting from people from appearing in dress not becoming of his or her sex, there were glimpses of regulation in the United States as far back as the 18th century, using South Carolina as a case study. Act No. 586 of his Act for the Better Ordering and Governing Negroes and Other Slaves, ratified 1735, dictated which textiles enslaved people were permitted to wear, sedimenting maximum measurements for N-word cloth, which emboldened white citizens to seize any and all clothing deemed too extravagant or refined for the enslaved. Jesus. The language of the law reads, and whereas many of the slaves in this province may wear clothes such much above the condition of slaves for the procuring whereof they use sinister and evil methods for the preventing thereof of such practices for the future, be it enacted by the authority aforesaid, that no owner or proprietor of any negro slave or any slave or other slave whatsoever, except liverymen or boys, shall permit or suffer such negro or other slave to have or wear any sort of apparel whatsoever finer, other, or greater value than negro cloth. Furthermore, in 1795, regulation was adopted to prohibit both the enslaved as well as the free person of color from wearing anything that might disguise themselves. What these prohibitions do is highlight the anxiety felt by the white ruling class about the people appearing or pretending to be something other than what that which local customs and laws permit them to be. In short, the laws of early South Carolina in general, and Charleston in particular, were very much concerned with physical appearance in the public realm and the role in constructing and maintaining a traditional social hierarchy. I wonder if this book has anything about caste. Pervasive throughout this era was the forbidding of disguise. That is, dressing in manners associated with different class status or profession, donning apparel that made white people appear as indigenous, as was often the case during populist protests like the Boston Tea Party, or black people appear as white. The laws became gender specific beginning in 1848 when the ordinance in Columbus, Ohio declared that it's forbidden for someone to appear in dress not belonging to his or her sex, picking up skew in 1868. Are you not going to cite this? An anonymous member of the city council introduced a bill to prevent and punish indecent exposure, improper conduct, and for other purposes, which was subsequently printed in the local newspaper. The bill reads in part as follows: be it ordained by the mayor and aldermen that if any person shall appear in public in a state of nudity or in dress not becoming his or her sex, and shall make any indecent exposure of his or her person, or be guilty of any lewd or indecent act or behavior, shall print, engrave, make exhibit, sell, or offer to sell any indecent or lewd book, picture, or any other thing, shall be subject to a fine not less than $20, nor exceeding $100, or imprisonment not exceeding 1 month. This dress crap is going to come back in America. The degree conflates, it might even still be on the books in some places, the degree conflates indecent exposure, e.g. nudity, with dressing in a manner not becoming of one's sex, and gender non-conforming dress is seen as on par with a criminal offense, guilty of lewd or indecent behavior of one's person, or of material like books or pictures. In other words, gender transgression is akin to and punishable on par with legal transgressions of indecency. This instantiates the gender binary system. Gender is a natural law deviation from which is likened to deviation from the pristine tenets of lawfulness. Such a deviation, though, was and is necessary for some, indeed life-sustaining and creating their myriad instances of the enslaved using, in the words of C. Riley Snorton, gender fungibility as contrivance for freedom, including Harriet Tubman's wearing her pants and disguising a black man in a bonnet to facilitate their escape, and Eliza at Uncle Tom's Cabin, cutting her hair and disguising herself as a boy and her son as a girl to facilitate her final flight to Canada, to Harriet Jacobs' assumption of masculine garb, a suit of sailor's clothes, jackets, trousers, and tarpaulin hat, among others that may have escaped the historical ledger. Enslaved black life utilized the fissures in normative gender as a means of escape, which is to say that black life and blackness enable their freedom their ability to live precisely through fissured gender, making blackness and black life given not only to fissuring gender, but indeed to being and becoming through fissured gender. Blackness is always itself and already proximal to and induxible of givenness of and given to understand. To an understanding of transness is what is being made clear in the above epigraph, in which bell hooks draws on queer black and trans feminist lesson from Sojourner's Truth, needing to negotiate her racialized non-womanhood. As allegorized through truth, there is a way that the nexus of black and women, instead of being an untroubled additive gesture, asserts that rather than accepting the existing assumptions about what a woman is and then trying to prove that she fit the standards, truth challenge the very standards themselves. Her actions demonstrate the process of deconstruction, namely exposing the concept of ideological or culturally constructed rather than its natural or simply a reflection of reality. What occurs at point zero of the conversion of black and woman is, as Patricia Collins concludes, deconstructing of the concept of woman. Blackness, as asserted and will continue to expand upon, is a force of transfiguration, of being becoming otherwise than a modality facilitating mutability and paracategorization, inasmuch as black skin has been made to index, albeit imperfectly as with any categorization and taxonomy, this modality, and inasmuch as it's presumed that such a physiognomy is an immutable bodily characteristic, other ways of ignoring oneself as a mechanism for identification took on potency that needed to be made as immutable and categorical as physiognomy. And thus, the various ways that one expressed oneself via dress, which was rife of class and gender significant power, needed to be curtailed. To mutate one's dress as a method for expressing gender, not becoming of one's sex, was taken as needing to be fixed, sedimented like physical blackness was presumed to be, and this substantially explicit in the 20th century, when medico-juridical practitioners invented medicalized notions of gender as a form of race, as a phenotype. See Gil Peterson's Histories of Transgender Child. She writes, it makes sense to say that in its invention, gender was a form of race. Morphology of sex and gender body was a racial formation. And John Money's theory of development, but more simply, gender was a phenotype, much as sex had been in the preceding 50 years. There's thus a generative convergence between blackness and gender non-normativity. Historically, there's often a connection between blackness and non-normative gender, or rather transness, through a thread of the possibility of insurrection or abolitionist sentiments, as an example in 1859. Carolyn Wilson was arrested by the chief police after circumstances transpired, which led to belief that he was not what he seemed, because of the unauspicious and non-self-determination of the outing. It seems to me I can neither assume he pronouns or she pronouns for that matter, nor certain identificatory grounding for Wilson. Wilson confessed that Wilson had regularly appeared in women's apparel since he was 10 years old, though confessed is much closer in my view to coerced. Two surviving reports indicate no charge for the arrest. The arrest having come from and effect no identifiable wrongdoing on Wilson's part. I'm dying. Or at least no de jure laws were transgressed. The point of noteworthiness here is what's said in local press. It's suspected that this disguise has been assumed for some ulterior purpose. It says he has been frequently in close conversation with Negroes. A suspicion has been raised in the mind of some that he is an abolition emissary. Information is up. There goes my second monitor, which has the text. We wait. I feel as if I contributed to this power outage because my AC is on. Interestingly, too, Wilson was identified as the same gay Lothario who was discovered showing the cloven foot in Charleston very recently. It seems that gay Lothario, whether accurate as to how Wilson would identify or not, is a kind of stand-up for gender transgression, that is, the language of transgression or transgender was unavailable to them. To describe Wilson's gender enactment, so gay Lothario may be the closest approximation of this. It's the only spot on the grid of intelligibility. Showing the cloven foot. Don't think I know what that means. Gender transgression is made to be close proximity. Let's Google it. To reveal a devilish character or an evil purpose. Yeah, but then what? I mean, that's what I figured, but I don't know what did Wilson do? Gender transition is made to be in close proximity to blackness, indeed to abolitionist sentiments. Wilson's transing of Wilson's gender invoked nefarious plots to append the conditions that subtend pervasive captivity. It might be argued that Wilson indexed and mobilized anti-captivity, dramatizing the articulatory nature of blackness and transness as abolition. Don't say this, just say the thing. Gender transgression is made legible through blackness and abolition. In other words, gender transness cannot help but evoke blackness, for both a radical insurrectionary posture is enacted through the socio-political side of race and gender. And such is the very aim of black transfeminism, to excavate and delineate the nebulous and generative texture of abolitionist gender radicality. How much longer? More pages, so I'm 2/3 through and my throat, my chest rebel. I think I'm sort of sick somehow. I don't think it's COVID. Let's take my temperature. Maybe I shouldn't do this on stream. Maybe this is a waste of time. As always, it says I have an implausibly low temperature, 98.3. Useless. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's good for my voice to keep doing this out loud. But I like streaming my research because then I have a record of my thoughts. So this is a very selfish thing. I should maybe just record locally, but I'm going to keep reading silently, and it's going to be useless for people watching, even more so than normal, but I'll highlight as I read. I'm never sure when people say they want to get rid of the state, whether they mean they want to get rid of the state or they want to get rid of the state. Like, you know, is this, am I reading an anarchist text? Let's put something in Hypernomicon. Let's put gender self-determination into Hypernomicon, and that's, I think, going to be a term. Do we make a gender glossary, or do we put gender under social ontology? Or I answered it myself. We put gender under. I'm now downloading this queering prison abolition thing. Good, it's 13 pages. I want this for myself, but I also want it for students. I've been looking for good abolitionist readings. Oh no, it's an interview. I hate this stuff. Oh well. And for some of us, police. I guess this just means some abolitionists. What does it mean to say something indexes something else? What does pairing mean? About or around. I kind of figured that out. Perimeter. Can I click on these? Okay, but I can't go back. I just destroyed myself. I'm really starting to feel ill. But That's no reason not to stop, not to keep streaming. I'd just be doing the same thing off stream. The question is, do I text the students who normally feed the dogs at night to tell them I may not be able to feed the dogs lunch? Let's find out what is for lunch. Sorry, we are now departing from the stated purpose of this stream, which is to do research, and we are now moving into a very different stream where I try to figure out whether I'm going to be able to feed lunch to stray dogs outside campus this afternoon. As I feel like crap. It's chicken for lunch, so it'd be a shame if there's leftovers and the dogs don't get it. If there's never leftovers when there's chicken, so what do I do? I'll just send a WhatsApp message, see if anyone's available. I think students are sometimes better because I can't speak Hindi, so I don't know how to ask, do you have any leftover chicken? And the students could maybe do something. Seems like maybe nobody fed dinner last night, which means there's no chance anybody's going to feed lunch today, so I'll just do it. Hopefully I don't get sicker between now and lunchtime. Now and the end of lunch, I mean. This all sounds kind of aspirational as opposed to settled. I don't understand what it is for a cartographical map to have been imposed as our bodies. think I'm gonna like the first and the third better. I think the cat just made a weird noise. This sounds interesting. This sounds interesting too. Sorry, whose is this? I don't know what the conceit of origins is. Maybe it's this. We're gonna... Oops. Oopsies. I'm gonna make a don't think I can do 30 more pages. I'm sick. Okay, the stream ends now. This seems like a cool book. I will keep reading.